Many of you have seen this slide when I've spoken previously. I just always like to come back to it because it was at this very hotel 12 years ago. I was serving as CEO of the National Institute for Animal Agriculture, filling in as an interim during that summer, which we hosted the ID Info Expo, and some of you remember that very well. And as I've told the story before, the reason that was so meaningful is because Secretary Johans was here. It was the first time, I always tell this story, it's the first time I'd ever seen anybody hold, his handlers had 2 BlackBerries, and you know, it's like, wow, that was before all of us had smartphones, right? But we had our little share of protesters out in the street, and they were the black helicopter people, and this is what we saw, and this is what we had, and we had to worry about security and what have you. So I think we've come a long ways since then. So we are making progress. Leanne just shared this slide with you from the World Perspective Study. I think we're all familiar with that. But again, I mean, these are the tenets that we need to follow. I think we've heard those things over the last day and a half. From my assessment, I think we're being pretty much right on target in terms of following these basic tenets. Has to be industry driven, have to serve both public and private interests, and I think within that sometimes we don't talk enough about what are truly the public interests. What does that mean? Because we talk a lot about producers, but I think we have to recognize all the vendors and the rural economy and all the connection to what happens in an economic world, right? Those are also the public interests. And I'm not sure we really think about that enough as we go down through all of this. Okay, and obviously, we've just talked about these kinds of things, and again, I don't want to beat that up because Leanne talked about that. So I just want to, as kind of bring all of this home, I think of this as we've had 4 weeks of class, we're getting ready for a test, and I'm having a review session, and this is what's going to be on the test, right? These are the things that I kind of thought, if you were my student in a classroom when I was an academician, I'm going to tell you, this is what's important to me, and this is what's going to be on the test tomorrow, right? So, I think clearly we heard from USDA back in April with their summary document that the lovely bright tags are going away. I think we heard that loud and clear yesterday, did we not? That they are going to go away at some point. We did not get a definitive timeline. We heard 2019 phase in. I didn't ask the question yesterday. I wanted to ask, what does phase out mean? What does that really look like? But nonetheless, these are going away. Now, the challenge that we hear about those is that we're going to swap those out for some kind of electronic identification. And the issue always becomes about those tags are expensive, and that we're going to have a system that's expensive. And this is a conversation that we had in the working group meeting on Monday afternoon. But I think one thing that we have to remind ourselves in that conversation as we begin to transition, all we're doing when we have that conversation is we're looking only at the direct costs of the tags and or readers and what have you. And yes, I understand that's very important. What we don't talk enough about are the indirect costs associated with the bright tags. Plus, they don't work. Dr. Speer said, even admitted, that we've got about a 1 in 6 failure rate in those things. Because it's not that the tags fail, we fail as humans. Because we put those things in and people are tired, they don't write the numbers down right. So we're spending a lot of time, which is money, into using a tool that probably isn't working nearly as well as we would like. So we're kind of defeating the purpose. So there's an indirect cost there. And I think we need to be think about that. And I think it was Chip yesterday who brought up, let's put this in perspective, okay? And again, we never want to make unnecessary costs, but we also have to put this in mind that if you're purchasing a $2 tag, what does it look like relative to your total cost, for example, of running a cow for a year? These are LMIC annual cow costs. It's about what I know of the industry. When I talk to producers, if they're realistic about their cow costs, okay, what's it going to cost you to run a cow for a year? On average, $800 to $900. Okay, if you're realistic about it. I know there's producers out there that tell you it's $450 or $500, but it's going to be $800 or $900. Okay, so that's a pretty good number as we go forward. You know, I think we also need to remind ourselves that traceability is part of the beef industry long-range plan, and that's due to beef demand and disease resistance. This isn't anything new. The long-range plan says we're going to secure the broad adoption of individual animal ID traceability systems across the entire beef community. Okay? And that's not new. We've seen that. You know, as we talk about the national beef quality audits, and we go back to the first one in 1991, when I was still in graduate school at Colorado State, and we talked about all these things, external fat, seam fat, palatability, what have you. And we kept going through that. Those were all very tangible kinds of factors. But that began to change in 2005, 2011, 2016. The intangible of traceability, where cattle come from, where food comes from, is critical to what we call beef quality. Consumers do care about it. And so it becomes, again, a very important economic factor. So the question becomes, what are we missing out there if we don't do this? And I thought, Kevin, I was at the Feeding Quality Forum, but, you know, John Gerber, I thought he said it best. As we start talking about beef demand, it's what the consumer wants, and that's how we increase beef demand. Okay? And you never want to be going backwards, right? We want to sell more product at a higher price. So it's essential as we start talking about these things, and that's how Leanne makes a living, is because of this traceability and credence attributes, and just letting people have confidence in knowing where their product and their food comes from. Okay? It's interesting to me that McDonald's, in a Happy Meal, you get a toy and food. The food isn't traceable, but guess what is 100% traceable? The toy. I'm not kidding. The toy is 100% traceable. Okay? Leanne just, talked about this, and we could beat this to death here. I just grabbed the data off Foreign Ag System through the first half of 2018. We are at $350 per head premium. You work that out to a market perspective, that's $2,600 per hundred. And right now, through the first half of 2018, the fed markets averaged about $120. So you get to kind of break that out. And you start telling producers, you know what? $26 per hundredweight, $350 per head, is directly attributable to the export market. Now, the question always becomes, right, the pushback is, well, we don't have a traceability system, so who cares? If we implement traceability, will that make that number bigger? No, but it'll sure put a floor under it. It's insurance. It's a put option, right? We're going to put a floor under that number, because the last thing we want to do is give an international trade partner some excuse to take that away from us. And I thought Leanne did a great job of talking about how tenuous that can be. But we need to remind ourselves of how important this is in anything we do to put that at risk and not firm that up is critical. I don't think we know how ugly this business could be if that goes away. Even part of that, how damaging that could be. Okay, so my assignment to you then. We are at the 10-year anniversary when Lehman Brothers failed. You're all thinking, what does this have to do with anything? I hope you all go home and watch The Big Short. If you've already seen it, watch it again, maybe watch it twice, read the book. Actually, I thought the movie was much better than the book. But the whole story of the financial crisis was about what? Moral hazard. Moral hazard is when somebody else does something wrong and we're all subject to the consequences, right? And there's lots of kinds of examples. If you go to the office and you steal pencils, that's moral hazard because somebody else is paying for that, right? Okay? And we know that the financial crisis basically occurred because of subprime mortgages. Remember those? We don't talk about those much anymore. And the system was only as good as its weakest link. Right? And if you watch the movie and if you understand everything that happened in the financial crisis, it was all about collateralized debt obligations. Everybody tracking with me? Right? And we'd wrap up all of these kinds of mortgages and we'd tier them. Remember the term tranches. And that bundled CDO ultimately was only as good as the weakest set of mortgages in that CDO. And that's what happened in the banking system. It's like we kind of tried to, push these kind of weaker subprime mortgages in with better ones and bundle them together, and ultimately they got rated too high and they all looked good. And what happened? The system collapsed. When I stop and I start thinking about what we do with traceability, and I go back to Delta County, Colorado on the western slope, and I think about where we were, and if we've got a cow herd and it's fully traceable and we've got ear tags in every cow and every calf we send out, but if my neighbor doesn't and there's a problem and somehow we figure out it comes back to Delta County, Colorado, I'm now subject to that subprime loan because I'm probably going to get shut down at least for a while because of inability to track or figure out what has happened. And so we share risk, right? It's systemic risk. So I think we need to keep thinking about that. So with that, the World Perspective Study talked about critical mass. Where do we need to be in terms of traceability for it to be meaningful? Right now, if we're talking about just ADT and adult animals represent roughly 20%, cows and bulls, 20% of the weekly kill. So we're down towards the lower end here. Okay? That inherently invokes the question, the hard question, what about feeder cattle? Okay? Because they represent about 75 to 80% of the weekly kill, week in, week out. And that ties back to that kind of debt, collateralized debt, big, short, moral hazard kinds of issues. Are we leaving ourselves vulnerable? So, you all, I think, have a pretty good handle on the pulse of the industry. Because if you look at the World Perspective Study and you start talking about producer attitudes in terms of traceability, firm opposition, 10%. Those people aren't going away. No matter what you do, you're not going to change their mind. If you give them $1,000 per head, it's not going to change their mind. Okay? But 90%, they're either resigned to it, they have cautious support, and then we've got 15% wholesale support. They're already doing it. But I think we're further along in terms of where we are with the industry than maybe we give producers credit for. And we need to keep moving in that direction. And so I'm reminded of diffusion of innovation. We know that there's always innovators, and we talk about as we start moving towards early adopters and early majority, and the hardest part in that is getting through what's called the chasm. And those of you that have ever implemented marketing programs and know trying to sell a new product out there in the business, is it new technology, you got to get through that chasm because it's hard. But this data tells me I think we've done the hard part. Right? We're through the chasm. We just have to give them something to go to. And I thought Chip did a really good job yesterday talking about empowerment. And so what I keep hearing over and over through the last day and a half is the need for communication and education. That we have to continue to emphasize the why to help bring producers along, because I thought Leanne mentioned it so well. It's not at the forefront of their minds. I just spent a weekend with my in-laws. Their biggest concern right now is that they're in the middle of a huge drought, a drought like they've never seen. Okay? But we need to continue to be upfront with them about these kinds of things and reminding them how important it is. And that's what I hear over and over as we went through yesterday and this morning, is the importance of education. And I always go back to Simon Sinek, right? Start with the why. We're talking a lot about logistics and challenges. We've got to remind them of the why, because they're ready to come along. So with that, last comment. I thought Ernie said it perfectly. It's not an emergency until it's an emergency. Right? We don't have time, and you all in this room just said we're moving too slowly. The most dangerous situations arise when the threat is ambiguous. This leads managers, leaders, business leaders, industry leaders, that's all of you. Well, you're not doing this, but to ignore or discount the risk and take a wait-and-see attitude. But the problem is, it's not an emergency until it's an emergency. So that kind of approach, I think, underscores the importance of communication and education and bringing producers along as we go forward. So, with that, back to work. Thank you all. You've been, I think, just a wonderful audience. We have had great engagement, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Thank you.